Oh, hello. Good morning. Good afternoon, wherever you are in the world. Good evening if you're in that part of the world. It's Saturday afternoon here in the Gulf Coast, United States, in Mississippi, Biloxi, Mississippi, by the beautiful Gulf of Mexico. And we're still going to call it that here because we don't believe in changing names that are unnecessarily changing names for the sake of changing names or whatever your fucking attitude is about it. Anyway, we're going to keep this really simple today. And hi, I'm JP Collins, Book of Hours. Julie is out sick. I am barely well myself. We're going to keep it simple. I'm going to mute now and then, like that, to cough. And the reason that we're going to keep it simple is because there's a lot going on. We got hit with a nexus of hell in the last 2 to 3 weeks, and it just feels like it just keeps snowballing. So we're gonna have to deal with that. But couple things, some announcements. Let's do some business first. Please support us. You can go to patreon.com/Book of Hours and become a patron. We're going to start switching things up a bit. You can also go to paypal.me/Book of Hours or Cash App, $Book of Hours. We're looking for your donations because it costs money to do this and we are no longer making money otherwise. So we need your support to continue the work that we do. We are going to start putting content behind the paywall on Substack, where Julie posts her written content and where a lot of these things get posted. And the reason for that is that we have a lot of followers, but we can no longer afford to do this for free. We're going to continue with some free content. Some of these readings, we're going to call them weekly readings because they won't always be on a Friday. Some of them are going to be for free, and some of them behind the paywall, depending on what they are. There's a lot of Substack people who do that, and it's not that we hate you. It's not that we don't want to give you things for free. It's just that we kind of need to start paying some bills that we're having trouble paying. I mentioned illnesses. Julie and I are both ill. We got what people are calling the crud. And it's been 10 days or more of coughing and whatnot. So if you've experienced it, you know what I'm talking about. If you haven't, I hope you don't get it. We've done a lot of different things to minimize its effects, and we've done pretty well with it. Anyway, so there's that. Mardi Gras is coming up, as you can see in my right-hand screen, your left-hand screen. We got some beads and some Mardi Gras things. So we're looking forward to that. We went to a cute little parade today. It was the children's walking parade. It was very sweet. Of course, they threw beads. And when we went home, there were beads all up and down Howard Avenue in Biloxi, downtown Biloxi. So you know it's Mardi Gras when you see beads on the ground. Okay, so today we're going to read. One more thing, one more bit of business. Julie's piece, I just wrote down. So she wrote a piece called "The Network State." She's going to be posting that on Substack, and that's going to be behind a paywall. She spent all week writing it, and we just don't feel like it needs to be for free now. Given the situation, we've been watching and monitoring what's going on in Washington at the Treasury building, Department of Treasury, and we're just appalled and shocked at what's taking place. I mean, we're literally watching a Nazi-like invasion of the federal government. I am not a fan of the federal government or any government for what that's worth. Okay, but at the same time, I live and I've been, living in this country, agreeing to the rules in order to get the benefits of living in a country where you apparently have protections and rights protected rights and protections from harm and invasion. That has been thrown out the window by a bunch of self-appointed narcissistic assholes who are basically fascism 3.0. They aren't kicking in your door; they're getting into your records and they're taking your money, and they're basically taking grandma's money, your mom's money, Julie's money. And it doesn't matter, what your views are on certain departments. It's all or nothing. And these guys don't care. Basically, what they're doing, they don't have any ideology when it comes to whether a government should support its people or not. They basically want all the money siphoned to them, and they don't want any of us to have any. But then they'll blame us for being poor, being stupid for being poor. So they'll blame us for being poor, and then they'll blame us for being stupid to be enough to be poor. These assholes think they're the smartest men in the world, the greatest men in the world. And I'm saying men too, because they're chauvinists, and they don't believe that women should have a say in anything. They don't think that they're basically a repurposing or the redo of apartheid. So you have Mussolini-like tactics and attitudes based on 21st century writings that are talking about how to do what they're actually doing, starting new countries that are basically virtual and based on crowdfunding and internet economy ideas, not even ideology. Their ideology is money, and that's all it is. And they want all of it, and they don't want any of us to have any of it. Okay, so that kind of goes along with the theme of the reading today, because what I'm reading about is a man named E.F. Schumacher, and I'm going to show that on the screen. This is on the Organic Radicals, part of the Winter Oak site, and he was an economist in the 20th century. He died in 1973, and I'm going to read a little bit about him. There's not much here. So I'm going to read this first, and then I'm going to read the entry. Ernest Friedrich Schumacher, born 1911, died 1977, was an economist and political thinker who challenged money-obsessed industrial capitalism and paved the way for the contemporary degrowth movement. He also called for a metaphysical renewal, which would fundamentally change the way people in the Western world saw their existence. So he's kind of the antithesis of what we're seeing now with the Doge crowd. He declared in 1977 the faith in 1977. Wait a minute, he died. I said 1977. I said he died in 1973. He died in 1977. This book, Small is Beautiful, came out in 1973. My bad. Sorry. The faith in modern man's omnipotence is wearing thin. Even if all the new problems were solved by technological fixes, the state of futility, disorder, and corruption would remain. It existed before the present crises became acute, and it will not go away by itself. More and more people are beginning to realize that the modern experiment has failed. And now, a lot of people point to modernism beginning at the end of the 17th century. So that would be the end of the 1600s and into the beginning of the 18th century with the Enlightenment, which was a philosophical movement that brought about the idea that governments could be democratic and that people could have autonomy over their lives and freedom, and away from the monarchies. I think that the modernist movement came into its own really at the beginning. Well, with the introduction of the Industrial Revolution. And what we live with today is the echoes and the fallout from that. So that's about 200 years of a conversion from the idea of owning people to as slaves to do things that you don't want to do in order to make money, to shifting over to making everybody become a slave through wages and employment, and this idea that you have to be employed in order to be taken seriously, or somebody that is a contributing member of society. Whereas before that, it wasn't about having a job. You did what you did. You were a farmer, or you were a craftsperson, or whatever it was, and it wasn't about having to work to have a paycheck in order to pay the bills, to own a house, and to do all these things. You just were a human, and you did what you did. And there was a sense of agency and autonomy with that, that we all long for now today. I read from a book, or Julie read from a book a while ago, called Shop Class is Soulcraft. And I don't know if you can see that. I'm off camera right now, so let me see. Okay, so there it is. Shop Class is Soulcraft. And she read from that book a while ago. And he was talking about how, agency through working with your hands, or just, having a say in what you do, and being able to be able to think around a problem and make it work for the problem at hand. So he gives examples of like electricians and plumbers and people in the trades who have that sense of agency in their work. The problem is presented. The skilled person understands what needs to be done. They get the appropriate tools, the appropriate materials, and they do the job, and it's done. And they can look back, almost like an artist can look back on what they've done, and see the work they did, and whether it's an elegant piece of work or they just slapped it together. Now, going back, in the screen here, you can see Small is Beautiful. This is my old copy of Small is Beautiful, and it's the cover's coming off, and it's an old paperback. It was used when I got a hold of it. It was $1.95 in the 1980s, and it's originally published, I think, 1975, and it's dusty and falling apart, and I have dust allergies on my skin to the point where it's like when I touch stuff like that, I got to go wash my hands and stuff. I've cleaned it up a little bit, but when I first picked it up off the shelf the other day, it was like making my hands itch. So that's why I'm using the PDF version today, so you can follow along as well. So anyway, let's go back to organic radicals. Schumacher is best remembered for his 1973 book, Small is Beautiful, a study of economics as if people mattered. And its message that infinite growth is a finite environment is an obvious impossibility. He explained that the idea of unlimited economic growth needed to be seriously questioned on at least two accounts: the availability of basic resources and the capacity of the environment to cope. He wrote, "Economic growth, which viewed from the point of view of economics, physics, chemistry, and technology, has no discernible limit, must necessarily run into decisive bottlenecks when viewed from the point of view of the environmental sciences." So what he's saying is that, if you look at the economy from, physics and chemistry and technology and economics, the sky's the limit. You can keep going, you can keep moving, you can keep growing and growing and growing. But when you look at it from a natural point of view, or the environmental sciences, as he calls it, you have limits. You cannot continually, mow down the forest without running out of trees. An attitude to life which seeks fulfillment in the single-minded pursuit of wealth, in short, materialism, does not fit into this world because it contains within itself no limiting principle, while the environment in which it is placed is strictly limited. Now, he talks about materialism, and we talk in materialism you could place on the shoulders of both capitalism and communism, and Marxism rather. So, they both those philosophies look at the world as something to be used in order to create what you need in your life. Whereas what he's coming to is like limiting that, and saying that we need to live with the world, live within our means of our ecospheres, live within the means of and live with nature, not separate ourselves from it, because we are part of it. And I think that pre-modern societies, did that. And it doesn't matter if they're European, African, North American, South American, whatever. It's understanding cycles of life, cycles of time, living in the environment, and with it, being of the world, not or in the world, not of it. Okay, let's get back to this. In the face of this, we had to look to evolve a new lifestyle with new methods of production and patterns of consumption, he said. A lifestyle designed for permanence. And that's what I'm talking about. As the title of the book conveys, he also saw it as important to restore a human scale to human self-organization. Centralization is mainly an idea of order, decentralization, one of freedom. And when we talk about centralization, we're talking about what's going on with, like, national states, right? The United States, England, France, Spain, Germany, whatever. Okay. What the Doge guys are trying to do is decentralize, but it's doing it in a way to where they're basically, Julie and I were talking about holding companies the other day. So holding companies go in, they buy a company, they strip it of its assets and leave it an empty shell to be, bought by somebody else. And I think that that's what the Doge guys are doing, is they're basically scraping out all the value that the United States has and keeping it for themselves. Schumacher's attack on centralization and the obsession with economic growth went hand in hand with a broader assault on industrial society itself. Let me go back to that thought. So their idea of decentralization is different than what we're talking about here. What Schumacher is talking about is smaller groups of people living together and possibly federating. It doesn't matter how you do it, but basically one of the chapters is 2 million villages. So if you have 2 million villages, you don't necessarily have nation states, right? And you have a way of living that is more in tune with where you live. Okay, so let me come back to this. I'm going to reread this paragraph I went away from. Schumacher's attack on centralization and the obsession with economic growth went hand in hand with a broader assault on industrial society itself. He noted in Small is Beautiful that modern man has built a system of production that ravishes nature and a type of society that mutilates man. So both nature and people are being hurt in what has been going on for the last 200 years. And he asked, what is the point of economic progress, a so-called higher standard of living, when the earth, the only earth we have, is being contaminated by substances which may cause malformations in our children and our grandchildren? He was also very clear in his rejection of techno-fixes, which claimed to protect the natural environment, but in fact further poisoned or degraded it. Now, let me respond to this. So, one of the things that I keep coming back to in response to the people who are always going, climate change, carbon, carbon. Nobody in this group of people who are talking about climate change, whether it exists or not, talk about pollution, which is exactly what the problem is. That's why people get sick. And we're actually, I feel like, and a lot of you agree with me on this, that the spraying in the skies that you see, the the injections in the stratospheric atmospheric injections, I think is what it is, SAIs. What you see in the sky contains very toxic chemicals, and whatever the reason for doing that, the effects are the same, and they're having a big effect, I think, on the environment overall. And then as far as techno fixes, I remember in the early 2000s the whole green business movement, when people were like, you can be eco and still be a consumer. No, you can't. It just doesn't work that way. So people were trying to maintain the lifestyle of modern living and still consider themselves eco. You just can't. There is no clean energy. There is no getting around the fact that machines and the modern transportation and modern energy use can be even clean. There is no clean energy. This whole idea of electric cars replacing the cars that we have as being, the way to go because there's no emissions coming out of the tailpipe is completely ridiculous. The mining and the manufacturing, the mining of the lithium, and lithium itself is one of the most toxic materials in the world, as well as other materials that you need to make the batteries for the cars, is just like it's even more toxic than just like digging for oil or drilling for oil. And the manufacturing of cars is no different than manufacturing regular cars. So what's the difference? Okay. I'm not saying we have to maintain what we have, and I'm not saying we have to go to horse and buggies right now, but we need to come up with something that gets us to the place we need to be, and it has to be gentle on everything, on everybody. Okay, getting back to the thing here. He warned, and this is talking about E.F. Schumacher here. He warned ever bigger machines entailing ever bigger concentrations of economic power and exerting ever greater violence against the environment do not represent progress. They are a denial of wisdom. Schumacher dismissed critics who assumed that a post-industrial society would necessarily amount to some kind of raw primitivism, reminding his readers that the Taj Mahal was built without electricity, cement, and steel, as were all the great cathedrals of Europe. His rejection of industrial capitalism went deeper than its physical infrastructures and challenged the ways of thinking which had allowed it to gain its stranglehold on our lives. One of these was the obsession with the idea of paid work of any kind, no matter how pointless or harmful, as being an essential bulwark of everyone's existence. He explained that soul-destroying, meaningless, mechanical, monotonous, moronic work is an insult to human nature, which must necessarily and inevitably produce either escapism or aggression, and that no amount of bread and circuses can compensate for the damage done. These are facts which are neither denied nor acknowledged, but are met with unbreakable conspiracy of silence, because to deny them would be too obviously absurd, and to acknowledge them would condemn the central preoccupation of modern society as a crime against humanity. Our separation from nature was, of course, another key problem. Modern man does not experience himself as part of nature, but as an outside force destined to dominate and destroy it. All of this was related to the loss in industrial capitalist societies of what he referred to as the traditional wisdom of mankind, as well as being inspired by the decentralist, degrowth economic ideas of Mohandas Gandhi and Leopold Kohr. Schumacher was also influenced by the metaphysical critique of modernity voiced by the perennialist tradition. Now, that means that perennialists, it's a philosophical tradition, and our friend W.D. James talks about that in his writings, so you can go over to Substack and read his work. He explained in a guide for the perplexed. Okay, I can speak. Schumacher explained in a guide for the perplexed that he had taken the term "the reign of quantity" from René Guénon, who we talked about before through W.D. James. One of the few significant metaphysicians of our time. And in Small is Beautiful, he quoted both Aldous Huxley and Ananda Kuraswamy. It was this aspect of Schumacher's thinking which laid behind his judgment that while wealth may still be accumulating, the quality of man declines. It also informed his criticism of the one-dimensionality of modern thought, in contrast to the three-dimensional structure of traditional wisdom. Contemporary society rejected ideas of higher and lower degrees of quality in favor of judgments based purely on quantity. And yet the idea of something being higher was almost universally used in traditional ways of thinking across the world, he said. Higher always means and implies more inner, more interior, deeper, more intimate, while lower means and implies more outer, more external, shallower, less intimate. This synonymity can be found in many languages, perhaps in all of them. Okay, we're getting down to the bottom here. It was also at the root of our ethical judgments, which regarded good as being a higher quality than evil, argued Schumacher. He observed the modern world tends to be skeptical about everything that demands man's higher faculties, but it is not at all skeptical about skepticism, which demands hardly anything at all. The scientific materialist approaches to all areas of thought he had made our society incapable of grasping the meaning behind things, he said. Its flat and fragmented analysis meant people could only ever see the trees rather than the woods. He remarked, to say that life is nothing but a property of certain peculiar combinations of atoms is like saying that Shakespeare's Hamlet is nothing but a property of peculiar combination of letters. Schumacher said we need to make full use of what he called our intellectual senses, adding, without them, we should be unable to recognize form, pattern, regularity, harmony, rhythm, and meaning, not to mention life, consciousness, and self-awareness. He insisted that a metaphysical reconstruction was needed to restore our lost wisdom and lead us out of the dead-end industrialism we are suffering from a metaphysical disease, and the cure must therefore be metaphysical. In Small is Beautiful, he demonstrated the connection between his metaphysical and his political views by proposing Buddhist economics as a possible way forward, but made it clear that this was really a question of reactivating universal ancient wisdom, the old gnosis, as prescribed by Theodore Rosnak. When you see a name underlined here in the text, it means that there's another article in the Organic Radicals about that person. The essential point was for humankind to turn its back on the hollowness and the fundamental unsatisfactoriness of a life devoted primarily to the pursuit of material ends, to the neglect of the spiritual, and the pretense that everything has a price, or, in other words, that money is the highest of all values. We need, said Schumacher, was a metania, a turning around of a brink of civilizational catastrophe. Okay, so that's from Winter Oak's Organic Radicals, and you can go to Winter Oak, just search on Winter Oak blog, and you'll find everything you need there. I think what we're facing right now is that collapse of civilization that he was speaking of. Let me bring that back. That last little bit there. Civilizational catastrophe, and I think that's what's happening at the Treasury Department right now, with the idea of networks, the network state, and the Doge assholes. They're seeing everything monetized. They're seeing everything as monetary value. They're seeing everything as something that they can exploit. And what a lot of people have been calling for is a spiritual revolution. And I want to also say that, I've been dealing with job loss, and I'm not the only one. And the reason I want to bring this up is because there was a mention of working in the modern world, and I talked about this, about wage slavery, etc. And I want to say that there are a lot more people out of work than you even realize. The reports are saying that job growth is up and unemployment is down, and that's completely false because they're using false information to tell you what's going on. When people fall off the dole, when their benefits, their unemployment benefits run out, they fall off the records too. So it makes it look like there's more people employed than there are. The only social media site that you will see that you will go to where you will see that people are actually out of work is on LinkedIn, which is not a site that I like to spend a lot of time on because it's like Facebook at work. It's all the ickiness of Facebook while being, working in the corporate world. But people are talking about their experiences, and people are not happy. And every other person you see listed there is out of work. So our economy is being, it's not falling apart on its own. It's actually being siphoned off. And our politicians are all right with that. There was a court order. It was my brain is with the illness. So sorry. It was basically a stay to tell the Doge folks to stay away from the Treasury building, or at least from certain aspects of it. They didn't say that they were banned outright. They just couldn't get into the files. They couldn't have access to the servers. Okay, so it's always this half-assed approach to fixing things instead of like getting rid of the whole thing. Even like the people talking on LinkedIn, it's like they're not looking at the entire problem. The problem is fucking capitalism. The fucking problem is that people are out of work. They trusted the system, and they trusted a country to take care of them by following the rules, doing what they're told, and being a good corporate citizen, and being a good friend, good little robot. And now everybody's paying the price for going along with their own self-enslavement, and me included with that. No different. But the thing is that the system has set it up in such a way to where you can't work outside of the system unless you have found a very special way to get out of it, even if you're self-employed. There is no easy work. And there even, and these people that are saying that people on welfare are scraping off, the money, and they're stealing from the government and from us, and they're lazy, and they're, ineffectual, etc. No. The thieves are the people who are at the top of the economy. Why is it that a CEO makes hundreds of millions, or tens of millions of dollars? I'm talking about CEO Sir Andrew Whitty. He gets paid more than any other CEO in the health world, in the health industry. He makes tens of millions of dollars. Why does he deserve that? And why is it that people that are in the services, people who work in restaurants or work in retail or whatever, are only allowed to make up to $20 an hour? And why is it Walmart's allowed to get away with paying their people so little while they're helping them get onto welfare? They're basically offsetting what they're paying the people to the government. So there's nothing right about this system. It's all fucked up. And it's because of the greed that is going on with the people at the top who think that they deserve more than the rest of us do because they were connected, they went to a good school, they came from good families, they had a better start in life than the rest of us did. I've done pretty damn well for myself as a working class kid. But the problem is that at every stage of my life, there have been interruptions, and I'm sure a lot of you have experienced that as well. Not to say, the other thing too is like, not only am I like a working class kid, I found my way to school. I was able to go to college with a very little amount of help. I was married at the time in another marriage, and my wife didn't pay for my school, but she worked while I went to school, while I worked part-time and went to school. And so she kept the roof over our head, paid the bills. I paid some of them because I was working part-time. My school was not that expensive, so I didn't have to take out loans. That's how I was able to manage. But that's not the reality anymore for people. And so it keeps getting worse and worse and worse as the generations go along. Well, so here's the other thing though. It's like I had an art degree of all things, and yet I was still able to get in, start working as a corporate slave. So I did something right, or I was just in the right place at the right time. And I think that's the case pretty much with all these people who are successful at the top. They were born into the right families. They were born at the right time, in the right place. And they think they're God-given geniuses for doing it. And that's not the case at all. And they don't deserve what they have. We all work hard. We're all smart. We all do what we need to do to live. This country was supposedly built on the idea of meritocracy. They didn't come out and say that back then. But it really wasn't. That was a lie too. It was designed and built by the same people who are at the top right now. These are the people who called the shots, and they basically got the rest of us to come along and get duped into the idea of liberty and freedom. Well, it was freedom and liberty for them. And along the way, they gave us the rights and privileges that we have because they needed us to do things. So it was basically a bribe. And that bribe was, hey, come along with us. We'll give you freedom and liberty and protections and whatever. And oh, hey, we need more people in the workforce, and so we can't do that unless women have the right to vote. So let's give women the right to vote. Yeah, okay, sure, why not? Okay, so now suddenly women have the right to vote to quell the violence that was beginning to erupt. They let unions come into play because of the violence. They were afraid of the violence that was going to come about. Right now, we are so complacent and so easily manipulated. They aren't afraid of us anymore. Enough said about that. Let's go to chapter 5 of Small is Beautiful, because I'm afraid I'm going to say something that I don't want to say on air. Okay. And this is chapter 5 of this publication of E.F. Schumacher's Small is Beautiful, A Question of Size. I was brought up on an interpretation of history which suggested that in the beginning was the family, then families got together and formed tribes, then a number of tribes formed a nation, then a number of nations formed a union or United States of this or that, and that finally we could look forward to a single world government. Ever since I heard this plausible story, I have taken a special interest in the process, but could not help noticing that the opposite seemed to be happening. A proliferation of nation states. The United Nations organization started some 25 years ago with some 60 members, Now there are more than twice as many, and the number is still growing. And remember, this was written in 1973, so just keep that in mind. In my youth, this process of proliferation was called balkanization and was thought to be a very bad thing. Although everybody said it was bad, it has now been going on merrily for over 50 years. In most parts of the world, large units tend to break up into smaller units. This phenomenon, so mockingly the opposite of what I have been taught, whether we approve of it or not, should at least not pass unnoticed. Second, I was brought up on the theory that in order to be prosperous, a country had to be big. The bigger, the better. This also seemed quite plausible. Look at what Churchill called the pumpernickel principalities of Germany before Bismarck. And that he's talking about the turn of the 19th into the 20th century. And then look at the Bismarckian Reich. Is it not true, and this is going back to the late 19th century, is it not true that the great prosperity of Germany became possible only through this unification? All the same, the German-speaking Swiss and German-speaking Austrians who did not join did just as well economically. And if we make a list of all the most prosperous countries in the world, we find that most of them are very small, whereas a list of all the biggest countries in the world shows most of them to be very poor indeed. Here again, there is food for thought. And third, I was brought up on the theory of economics of scale, that industries and firms, just as with nations, there is an irresistible trend dictated by modern technology for units to become ever bigger. Now it is quite true that today there are more large organizations and probably also bigger organizations than ever before in history. But the number of small units is also growing, and certainly not declining in countries like Britain and the United States. And many of these small units are highly prosperous and provide society with most of the really fruitful new developments. Again, it is not altogether easy to reconcile theory and practice, and the situation as regards this whole issue of size is certainly puzzling to anyone brought up on these three concurrent theories. And I'm going to stop here and just come out and say, I used to live in the state of California, and now and then people would posit the idea of California splitting off. It never will, it didn't happen. It never will, at least in the way that we're looking at things now. But in the state of California, if it was a country, would be like the fifth or sixth largest economy in the world, just on its own. I mean, it's a very populous state. It's also very large geographically, but compared to the size of the United States, it's very small. And so this kind of falls in line with what he's talking about. It all depends on, California has just about everything you need to live a very lovely life. But, because greed comes into play, people have pretty much ruined the fucking place. So we're now living in a place that's pretty nice, but it's a very poor place. And it could be much different if it were treated differently. Okay, back to the reading. Even today, we are generally told that gigantic organizations are inescapably necessary. And let me just say, I just stopped working for an organization that's like one of the largest, organizations in the world. And it's just disgusting how they just keep enveloping other companies to make themselves bigger. And all they really do is just sell their services to other services and organizations within the giant company. So what's the point of this company? It's basically it's eating itself. Okay, so let me go back. Even today, we are generally told that gigantic organizations are inescapably necessary. But when we look closely, we can notice that as soon as great size has been created, there's often a strenuous attempt to attain smallness within bigness. The great achievement of Mr. Sloan and General Motors was to structure this gigantic firm in such a manner that it became, in fact, a federation of fairly reasonably sized firms. In the British National Coal Board, which, by the way, Schumacher was a consultant, he held some sort of position with the British National Coal Board, one of the biggest firms of Western Europe. Something very similar was attempted under the chairmanship of Lord Robins. Strenuous efforts were made to evolve a structure which would maintain the unity of one big organization and at the same time create the climate or feeling of there being a federation of numerous quasi-firms. The monolith was transformed into a well-coordinated assembly of lively, semi-autonomous units, each with its own drive and a sense of achievement. While many theoreticians who may not be too closely in touch with real life are still engaging in the idolatry of large size with practical people in the actual world, there is a tremendous longing and striving to profit at all possible. I don't know what's going on there. Oh, okay, I see. There's a tremendous longing and striving to profit at all possible from the convenience, humanity, and manageability of smallness. This also is a tendency which anyone can easily observe for himself. And I think we all wish for that. We all wish we had, a smaller approach to life, simplify. I think, we've all been seeing media and books and magazines and movements about smallness, the tiny house movement, or simplification. There's Simple Magazine and things of that nature. Let us now approach our subject from another angle and ask what it is actually needed, or what is actually needed. In the affairs of men, there always appears to be a need for at least two things simultaneously, which on the face of it seem to be incompatible and to exclude one another. We always need both freedom and order. We need the freedom of lots and lots of small autonomous units, and at the same time, the orderliness of large-scale, possibly global unity and coordination. When it comes to action, we obviously need small units because action is a highly personal affair, and one cannot be in touch with more than a very limited number of persons at any one time. But when it comes to the world of ideas, to principles, or to ethics, the indivisibility of peace and also of ecology, we need to recognize the unit of mankind and base our actions upon this recognition. Or to put it differently, it is true that all men are brothers, but it is also true that in our active personal relationships, we can in fact be brothers to only a few of them, and we are called upon to show more brotherliness to them than we could possibly show to the whole of mankind. And by the way, you're not going to like everybody either. We all know people who freely talk about the brotherhood of man while treating their neighbors as enemies. Just as we also know people who have, in fact, excellent relations with all their neighbors while harboring at the same time appalling prejudices about all human groups outside their particular circle. This is the way people are. What I wish to emphasize is the duality of the human requirement when it comes to the question of size. Them is no single answer. What does that? I wonder if this is a weird translation. When it comes to the question of size, there is no single answer. This must have been put together by AI. For his large different purposes, man needs many different structures, both small ones and large ones, some exclusive and some comprehensive. Yet people find it most difficult to keep two seemingly opposite necessities of truth in their minds at the same time. They always tend to clamor for a final solution, as if in actual life there could ever be a final solution other than death. For constructive work, the principal task is always the restoration of some kind of balance. Today, we suffer from an almost universal idolatry of gigantism. It is therefore necessary to insist on the virtues of smallness where this applies. If there were a prevailing idolatry of smallness, irrespective of subject or purpose, one would have to try and exercise influence in the opposite direction. The question of scale might be put in another way. What is needed in all these matters is to discriminate, to get things sorted out for every activity. There is a certain appropriate scale, and the more active and intimate the activity, the smaller the number of people that. So let me reread that. There is a certain appropriate scale, and the more active and intimate the activity, the smaller number of people that can take part, the greater the number of such relationship arrangements that need to be established. Take teaching. One listens to all sorts of extraordinary debates about the superiority of the teaching machine over some other forms of teaching. I don't know what he means by that. Maybe there was something going on, the teaching machine. I think he means like the broad, educational industrial complex. Well, let us discriminate. What are we trying to teach? It then becomes immediately apparent that certain things can only be taught in a very intimate circle, whereas other things can obviously be taught en masse via the air, via television, or the internet, as he didn't say because the internet didn't exist back then, via teaching machines and so on. What scale is appropriate? It depends on what we are trying to do. The question of scale is extremely crucial today in political, social, and economic affairs, just as in almost everything else. And let me just pause here for a second. Let me go back to the idea of teaching, via the teaching machine. Radio, when it was first conceived as a commercial or as a mass media, was sold with the idea of it being an educational device or educational tool, meaning that you could teach a bunch of people with radio. That went out the window very quickly because they realized quickly and very soon after that it was great for propaganda and advertising. So marketing and propaganda were like the main things that radio could do rather than teaching people. And that's I think that has a lot to do with what he's saying here. That you can't teach en masse. You can't have online learning and expect the children to be children and to be fully formed adults, because they're losing out on a lot of things like socialization and exchanging toxins with each other. What scale is appropriate? It depends on what we are trying to do. The question of scale is extremely crucial today in political, social, and economic affairs, just as in almost everything else. What, for instance, is the appropriate size of a city? And also, one might ask, what is the appropriate size of a country? Now, these are serious and difficult questions. It is not possible to program a computer and get the answer. The really serious matters of life cannot be calculated. Right, AI? We cannot directly calculate what is right, but we jolly well know what is wrong. I love that. We can recognize right and wrong at the extremes, although we cannot normally judge them finely enough to say this ought to be 5% more, or that ought to be 5% less. Take the question of size of a city. While one cannot judge these things with precision, I think it is fairly safe to say that the upper limit of what is desirable for the size of a city is probably something of the order of 500,000 inhabitants. And that's a little smaller than, around the size, a little smaller than San Francisco. Maybe San Francisco now, but it was about 750,000 people. But we're all stuffed into about 49 square miles, so you have to consider the size of the place too. It is quite clear that above such a size, nothing is added to the virtue of a city. In places like London or Tokyo or New York, the millions do not add to the city's real value, but merely create enormous problems and produce human degradation. So probably the order of magnitude of 500,000 inhabitants could be looked upon as the upper limit. The question of the lower limit of a real city is much more difficult to judge. The finest cities in history have been very small by 20th century standards. The instruments and institutions of city culture depend, no doubt, on a certain accumulation of wealth. But how much wealth has to be accumulated depends on the type of culture pursued. Philosophy, the arts, and religion cost very, very little money. Other types of what claims to be high culture, space research, or ultramodern physics, cost a lot of money, but are somewhat remote from the real needs of men. I would say people. And that's something else that I've noticed a lot too. Is that both physics and science and mathematics and these areas of study that have become so large and removed from people. The specialization has created a situation where people don't understand what these sciences offer and what they're about and what value they bring to life. So just as he said, space research or ultramodern physics costs a lot of money, but are somewhat remote from the real needs of men. That's true. And the bigger they get, or the more removed they get in their, I'll use the cliche, ivory towers, the more difficulty we have in understanding what their value is and why they need to be there in the first place. Why is that money being spent on that stuff? Fuck SpaceX. All that's trying to do is take over from NASA, which probably shouldn't exist either. I raise the question of proper size of cities both for its own sake, but also because it is, to my mind, the most relevant point when we come to consider the size of nations. The idolatry of giganticism that I've talked about is possibly one of the causes and certainly one of the effects of modern technology, particularly in matters of transport and communications. A highly developed transport and communication system has one immensely powerful effect. It makes people footloose, not like the movie. Millions of people start moving about, deserting the rural areas and the smaller towns to follow the city lights, to go to the big city, causing pathological growth. Take the country in which, and going back to the last thing I read, or the last time I was reading right around Christmas time, I was talking about the Industrial Revolution and the rituals around the Christmas season and how that was changed to fit the needs of the new industrial and urban landscape. It dehumanizes people by moving them to these places where they probably shouldn't be in the first place. These cities, they don't really need to develop and become larger. Take the country in which all this is perhaps most exemplified, the United States. The sociologists are studying the problem of megapolis. The word metropolis is no longer big enough, hence megapolis. And I grew up in a megapolis. I grew up in Southern California, where it was LA to San Diego, with maybe a little bit of open space in between. And that was called a Marine base. They freely talk about the polarization of the population of the United States into the three immense megalopolitan areas. Wow, that's a mouthful. That's a $20 word there. One extending from Boston to Washington, a continuous built-up area with 60 million people, one around Chicago, another 60 million, and one on the West Coast from San Francisco to San Diego. Again, a continuous built-up area with 60 million people, the rest of the country being left practically empty, deserted provincial towns, and the land cultivated with vast tractors, combine harvesters, and immense amounts of chemicals. And that's true. I mean, if you're thinking of it not just as the built-up land like housing, California from San Francisco to San Diego, when there isn't housing tracts, which are now replacing some of this corporate farming, massive farming going on in the valley and along the coast, yeah, that's what you see. You see some sort of intervention on the by people, whether it's logging or farming or housing or something's going on there. The valley is fed water through the aqueduct, which is taken from a beautiful lake in Northern California, Mono Lake, or Mono Lake, as a lot of people like to call it. And it's a weird fucking artificial river that goes from Northern California down to Southern California. It's an odd thing to watch. Anyway, so a megapolis. If this is somebody's conception of the future of the United States, it is hardly a future worth having. But whether we like it or not, this is the result of people having become footloose. It is the result of that marvelous mobility of labor which economists treasure above all else. Everything in this world has to have a structure, otherwise it is chaos. And by the way, nature is more structured and organized than people are. It's people who are chaotic. Animals, plants, there's an order to nature that people don't recognize any longer. Before the advent of mass transportation and mass communications, the structure was simply there. Because people were relatively immobile. People who wanted to move did so. Witness the hood of saints from Ireland moving all over Europe. There were communications, there was mobility, but no footlooseness. Now a great deal of structure has collapsed. And a country is like a big cargo ship in which the load is in no way secured. It tilts, and all the load slips over, and the ship founders. And I would say that's about where we are right now. One of the chief elements of structure for the whole of mankind is, of course, the state. The translation here says the stale. The state. And one of the chief elements or instruments of structuralization, if I may use that term, is frontiers, national frontiers. Now, previously, before this technological intervention, the relevance of frontiers was almost exclusively political and dynastic. Frontiers were delimitations of political powers, determining how many people you could raise for war. Economists fought against such frontiers becoming economic barriers, hence the ideology of free trade. But then people and things were not footloose. Transport was expensive enough so that movements of both of people and goods were never more than marginal. Trade in the pre-industrial era was not a trade in essentials, but a trade in precious stones, precious metals, luxury goods, spices, and unhappily slaves. The basic requirements of life had, of course, to be indigenously produced. So you wouldn't get raspberries from South America in the wintertime, etc. And the movement of populations, except in periods of disaster, was confined to persons who had a very special reason to move, such as the Irish saints or the scholars of the University of Paris. But now, and I might also add, like, the pilgrims, and I don't mean the ones that came to the United States from England, not the Puritans, but pilgrims, meaning people who would travel around Europe from holy site to holy site, and their purpose was to see where saints lived and view the exhibited relics, which were the bones of the saints, or some sort of artifact left over from that person's life. But now everything and everybody has become mobile. All structures, even our phones, all structures are threatened, and all structures are vulnerable to an extent that they have never been before. So, I mean, he was looking at this in 1973 and thinking it was bad. Now we're in 2025. Oh boy. Economics, which Lord Keynes had hoped would settle down as a modest occupation similar to dentistry, that's awesome, suddenly becomes the most important subject of all. economic policies absorb almost the entire attention of government and at the same time become ever more impotent. So they become important and impotent at the same time. The simplest things, which only 50 years ago one could do without difficulty, cannot get done anymore. The richer a society, the more impossible it becomes to do worthwhile things without immediate payoff. Economics has become such a thraldom that it absorbs almost the whole of foreign policy. People say, yes, we don't like to go with these people, but we depend on them economically, so we must humor them. Oh, it sounds like working for a corporation, right? It tends to absorb the whole of ethics and to take precedence over all other human considerations. Now, quite clearly, this is a pathological development, which has, of course, many roots, but one of its clearly visible roots lies in the great achievements of modern technology in terms of transport and communications. While people with an easygoing kind of logic believe that fast transport and instantaneous communications opens up a new dimension of freedom, which they do in some rather trivial respects, think about it. How much time do you spend on your phone? You're probably watching me on a phone right now. While people with an easygoing kind of logic believe that fast transport and instantaneous communications open up a new dimension of freedom, which they do in some rather trivial respects, they overlook the fact that these achievements also tend to destroy freedom by making everything extremely vulnerable and extremely insecure, unless conscious policies are developed and conscious action is taken to mitigate the destructive effects of these technological developments. Now, these destructive effects are obvious, most severe in large countries because, this is the part that got me to read this whole chapter to you. And by the way, this book is made up of a series of essays that he wrote. So it wasn't written originally as a book. It was put together as a series. They took essays that he had written and made a book and kind of made, a coherent narrative out of it. Now, these destructive effects are obviously more severe in large countries because, as we have seen, frontiers produce structure, and it is a much bigger decision for someone to cross a frontier, to uproot himself from his native land and try to put down roots in another land than to move within the frontiers of his country. The factor of footlooseness is, therefore, the more serious, the bigger the country. Its destructive effects can be traced both in the rich and in the poor countries. In the rich countries, such as the United States of America, the United States, it produces, as already mentioned, megapolis. It also produces a rapidly increasing and ever more intractable problem of dropouts, of people who, having become footloose, cannot find a place anywhere in society. Directly connected with this, it produces an appalling problem of crime, alienation, stress, social breakdown, right down to the level of the family. In the poor countries, again, most severely in the largest ones, it produces mass migration into cities, mass unemployment, and as vitality is drained out of the rural areas, the threat of famine. The result is a dual society without any inner cohesion, subject to a maximum of political instability. And this, there's a straw man argument out there about regarding immigration. And I'm not going to get into that argument necessarily. Because it goes into areas of, racism and separation from the world and all kinds of arguments that are kind of beside the point. The thing is that we have gotten to a point now to where we are depending on poor people from other countries to grow our food for us instead of doing it our fucking selves. There was a time when, my fucking grandfather had a farm. And he used it to help his family get by. He was a number of things. I never did find out why he started a farm, or why he got into farming in the first place? I need to ask my mother that one, because it comes up now and then, like, your grandfather had a farm for a while and we grew cucumbers and blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, okay, how did that even happen? Right? That couldn't happen today. There's only some people in the world, in the country now, who are probably, college educated, and they have, some family money and maybe some land that they inherited. Their family has some farming roots, who are able to go in and go, you know what? I want to take this small plot of land and turn it into a little organic, artisanal farm where, I sell, artisanal corn, and I, package it up into wooden boxes and sell it to people in the city, and they, whatever, you get what I'm saying. My grandfather, he was a farmer, he was a truck driver, and he was an electrician, all within a lifespan about the time that I've been on the world, right? He retired. He was able to retire in his early to mid 60s. You can't do that now. And that's, I think, part of the problem is what is being outlined here in this article. So, or in this essay. So let me continue. Let me find my place. Okay, footlooseness. Having become footloose, cannot find a place anywhere in society. Right. So that's the homelessness, and people who are not homeless, like myself. Directly connected with this, it produces an appalling problem of crime, alienation, stress, social breakdown, right down to the level of the family. Okay, so we talked about that. In poor countries, again, most severely, the largest ones, it produces mass migration into cities, mass unemployment, and as vitality is drained out of rural areas, the threat of famine. The result is a dual society without any inner cohesion, subject to a maximum of political instability. And that's what we're facing right now in the United States. A big country, allegedly a rich country, but apparently we're a poor country. As an illustration, let me take the case of Peru. The capital city, Lima, situated on the Pacific coast, had a population of 175,000. So that's roughly the size of San Francisco. No, that's smaller. Sorry. I'm thinking 750,000. Okay, that's a small city. Okay, it's 175,000 in the early 1920s, just 50 years ago. Okay, so 1973 back to the 20s. Okay, so that's 50 years difference. I mean, now we're looking at 50 years difference between when this book was written and now. Okay, so 100 years ago, its population is now approaching 3 million in the 1970s. That's a big city now. The once beautiful Spanish city is now infested by slums, surrounded by misery belts. Misery belts, I love that. I don't love that. I mean, I like that term. That's horrible. It sounds like where San Francisco is going now. The once beautiful Spanish city is now infested by slums, surrounded by misery belts that are crawling up the Andes. That's a very interesting idea. But this is not all. People are arriving from the rural areas at a rate of 1,000 a day, and nobody knows what to do with them. The social or psychological structure of life in the hinterland has collapsed. People have become footloose and arrive in the capital city at the rate of 1,000 a day to squat on some empty land against the police, who come to beat them out, to build their mud hovels, and to look for a job. And nobody knows what to do about them. Nobody knows how to stop the drift. Imagine that in 1864, Bismarck had annexed the whole of Denmark. Imagine that in 1864, Bismarck had annexed the whole of Denmark instead of only a small part of it, and that nothing had happened since. The Danes would be an ethnic minority in Germany, perhaps struggling to maintain their language by becoming bilingual, the official language, of course, being German. Only by thoroughly Germanizing themselves could they avoid becoming second-class citizens. There would be an irresistible drift of the most ambitious and enterprising Danes, thoroughly Germanized to the mainland into the south, and what then would be the status of Copenhagen. That of a remote provincial city, or imagine Belgium as part of France, what would be the status of Brussels? Again, that of an unimportant provincial city. I don't have to enlarge on it. Imagine now that Denmark, a part of Germany, and Belgium, a part of France, suddenly turned what is now charmingly called Nats, wanting independence. So this must have been a phrase bantied about at the time, Nats wanting independence. There would be endless heated arguments that these non-countries could not be economically viable, that their desire for independence was, to quote a famous political commentator, adolescent emotionalism, political naivety, phony economics, and sheer barefaced opportunism. That's why you can't have Scotland be on its own. That's why you can't have parts of Spain be on their own. That's the same thing that they threw out there now, and this is 50 years later. How can one talk about the economics of small independent countries? How can one discuss a problem that is a non-problem? There is no such thing as the viability of states or of nations. There is only a problem of viability of people. People, actually persons like you and me, are viable when they can stand on their own feet and earn their keep. You do not make non-viable people viable by putting large numbers of them into one huge community. And you do not make viable people non-viable by splitting a large community into a number of smaller, more intimate, more coherent, and more manageable groups. All this is perfectly obvious, and there is absolutely nothing to argue about. Some people ask, what happens when a country composed of one rich province and several poor ones falls apart because the rich one secedes? Most probably the answer is nothing very much happens. The rich will continue to be rich and the poor will continue to be poor. But if before secession the rich province had subsidized the poor, what happens then? Well then, of course, the subsidy might stop, but the rich rarely subsidize the poor. More often they exploit them. They may not do so directly so much as through the terms of trade. They may obscure the situation a little by a certain redistribution of tax revenue or small-scale charity, but the last thing they want to do is secede from the poor. Why is that? Because the rich exploit the poor. They need them around, just like here. We need poor brown people from south of the border to grow our vegetables, okay? Or take care of our homes, or even now, paint them or build them or whatever the case may be. And in the case of Europe, it's like poor white people from the eastern part of the continent to do, the same thing. It used to be the Irish in the United States, or, the Chinese or whatever. And that's now changed because those societies have been here long enough to establish themselves. But this kind of thing has always been the case. There's still poor people to exploit. And, what I was talking about earlier in the broadcast, they want all of us to be that. They want all of us to be poor and serving them, or just die. Well, some of the things that they're talking about is they want to warehouse the poor and put them on, virtual reality and let them just die, and then grind them up and use them as fuel, biofuel. So the rich have always exploited the poor. And then they make up lies about the poor that they're too lazy or too stupid to not be poor. And they say that it's your fault for being poor. And that's the furthest thing from the truth. I'm going to tell you something. We lived in a very poor community, as you know. Some of the most enterprising people in the world are the poor. It's just that they can't seem to make a living because they live in a world where they can't make a living. They only have the ability to work within the context of their world, and that is if they can pick up scrap metal, put it in their shitty beat up truck, and take it to the scrapper and make a little money, they're able to put gas in the car. They don't have access to better jobs because those better jobs are hard enough to find for the people who are in the middle, let alone the people who have no experience getting those jobs. But the rich rarely subsidize the poor. More often, they exploit them. They may not do so directly so much as through the terms of trade. They may obscure the situation a little by certain redistribution of tax revenue or small-scale charity. Oh, there's another one, charity. But the last thing they want to do, I gave it the office, but the last thing they want to do is secede from the poor. The normal case is quite different, namely that the poor provinces wish to set. Okay, so the normal case is quite different, namely the poor provinces wish to separate from the rich, and that the rich want to hold on because they know that exploitation of the poor within one's own frontiers is infinitely easier than exploitation of the poor beyond them. Right? So if you've got poor close to you and they're in your borders, it's easier to exploit them than it is if they're in another country. That's why we bring people into the United States to grow our vegetables or work on our houses. That's why liberals want to turn their heads. And I don't want to talk about the conservatives' objection to that because it's purely for other reasons. Because they want to exploit the poor just as much as anyone else. Now, if a poor province wishes to secede at the risk of losing some subsidies, what attitude should one take? Not that we have to decide this, but what should we think about it? Is it not a wish to be applauded and respected? Do we not want people to stand on their own feet as free and self-reliant men? So I'm going to go back to Scotland. I mean, Scotland compared to the United Kingdom or England, it's relatively poor, but it could do much better on its own, I think, than it could, currently. Anyway, so again, this is a non-problem. I would assert, therefore, that there is no problem of viability. By the way, I'm no nationalist. I just am pointing out the obvious and kind of going along with the theme of what we're reading here. I would assert, therefore, that there is no problem of viability, as all experience shows. If a country wishes to export all over the world, and import from all over the world, it has never been held that it had to annex the whole of the world in order to do so. Right, United States? What about the absolute necessity of having a large internal market? This again is an optical illusion. In the meaning of large is conceived in terms of political boundaries. I was talking about this in terms of corporate. I worked for Optum, which is part of United Health Group, and all they fucking do is like sell to themselves and sell their services to other health companies. So it's sort of like, a large internal market, and he says here, it's an optical illusion of in the meaning of large is conceived in terms of political boundaries. Needless to say, a prosperous market is better than a poor one, but whether that market is outside the political boundaries or inside makes on the whole very little difference. I am not, I love this R. I am not aware, for instance, that Germany, in order to export a large number of Volkswagens to the United States, a very prosperous market, could only do so after annexing the United States. But it does make a lot of difference if a poor community or province finds itself politically tied to or ruled by a rich community or province. Why? Because in a mobile, footloose society, the law of disequilibrium is infinitely stronger than the so-called law of equilibrium. Nothing succeeds like success, and nothing stagnates like stagnation. The successful province drains the life out of the unsuccessful. The rich exploit the poor. And without protection against the strong, the weak have no chance. Either they remain weak or they must migrate and join the strong. They cannot effectively help themselves. A most important problem in the second half of the 20th century is the geographical distribution of population, the question of regionalism. But regionalism is not in the sense of combining a lot of states into free trade systems. Right, NAFTA? But in the opposite sense of developing all the regions within each country. And I don't think he's talking about like what we've been talking about with globalization, where you've got, global governance, regional governance, and then local governance. He's not talking about that. This is a little different. But regionalism, not in the sense of combining a lot of states into free trade systems, but in the opposite sense of developing all of the regions within each country. This, in fact, is the most important subject on the agenda of all larger countries today. And a lot of the nationalism of small nations today and the desire for self-government and so-called independence is simply a logical and rational response to the need for regional development. In the poor countries in particular, there is no hope for the poor unless there is successful regional development, a development effort outside the capital city covering the rural areas wherever people happen to be. Otherwise you've got the fucking Hunger Games, right? If this effort is not brought forth, their only choice is either to remain in their miserable condition where they are, or to migrate into the big city where their condition will be even more miserable. It is a strange phenomenon indeed that the conventional wisdom of present-day economics can do nothing to help the poor. Let's see how much longer we have going on here. 2 more pages. Okay. Invariably, it proves that only such policies are viable as have, in fact, the result of making those already rich and powerful richer and more powerful. Right, Doge? It proves that industrial development only pays if it is as near as possible to the capital city or another very large town, and not in the rural areas. It proves that large projects are invariably more economic than small ones, and it proves that capital-intensive projects are invariably to be preferred as against labor-intensive ones. The economic calculus, as applied by present-day economics, forces the industrialist to eliminate the human factor because machines do not make mistakes, which people do. I don't know about that. I think machines make a lot of fucking mistakes. And in the case of AI right now, it's dismal. It's dismal. I had an interview the other day with an AI bot, and it was just ridiculous. It was disconcerting for one thing. But the other thing was it was just like it would ask the same question over and over again after I gave the answer. And it was a complicated answer. It wasn't yes or no. It was fun. It was lots of fun. And then it held up its 7 fingers to show me that it was real. I'm joking. That's a metaphor. Hence the machines never make mistakes, but people do. Hence the enormous effort at automation and the drive for ever larger units. This means that those who have nothing to sell but their labor remain the weakest possible bargaining position. This is why everybody's so miserable on LinkedIn right now. The conventional wisdom of what is now taught as economics bypasses the poor, the very people for whom development is really needed. The economics of gigantism and automation is a leftover of 19th century conditions and 19th century thinking, and it is totally incapable of solving any of the real problems of today. An entirely new system of thought is needed, a system based on attention to people and not primarily attention to goods. The goods will look after themselves. It could be summed up in the phrase production by the masses rather than mass production. What was impossible, however, in the 19th century is possible now. And what was in fact, if not necessarily, at least understandably, neglected in the 19th century is unbelievably urgent now. That is, the conscious utilization of our enormous technological and scientific potential for the fight against misery and human degradation. A fight in intimate contact with actual people, with individuals, with families, small groups, rather than states and other anonymous abstractions like NGOs and nonprofits and unelected committees that take over the government. And this presupposes a political and organizational structure that can provide this intimacy. What is the meaning of democracy, freedom, human dignity, standard? What is they put a period in there, it's throwing me off. What is the meaning of democracy, freedom, human dignity, standard of living, self-realization, fulfillment? Is it a matter of goods or of people? Of course, it is a matter of people. But people can themselves only in small comprehensible groups. People can be themselves only in small, comprehensible groups. Therefore, we must learn to think in terms of an articulated structure that can cope with a multiplicity of small-scale units. If economic thinking cannot grasp this, it is useless. If it cannot get beyond its vast abstractions, the national income, the rate of growth, capital output ratio, input output analysis, labor mobility, capital accumulation, if it cannot get beyond all this and make contact with human reality, the human realities of poverty, frustration, alienation, despair, breakdown, crime, escapism, stress, congestion, ugliness, and spiritual death, then let us scrap economics and start afresh. Are there not indeed enough signs of the times to indicate that a new start is needed? Okay, so that's the chapter, and I forget what it was called. It was called A Question of Size, from E.F. Schumacher's Small is Beautiful. I'm going to hide that and kind of wrap things up here. I would suggest you guys get a copy of this. It's easy to find on the used websites out there, used bookstores, online, or go to your go to your local store and see if they have it. If they don't have it, ask them to order it for you. Keep that economy going in the local sphere. What we're facing right now, what we're seeing going on, and even before Doge, even before Elon Musk and his fucking fascist cronies decided to do something that none of us can get away with. And I don't know how they're getting away with it. I think that, like what Julie's and I have been talking about, she said, I think a lot of this is a show that's covering up what's going on with the fact that millions of people in the United States are no longer employed. And we're concerned about, whether USAID is intact or not. I have a real concern for what's going on. This idea that an institution like Social Security is going to be just thrown away. I don't think it will. I don't think it's going to go away. But if it does, there's going to be a lot of people that are going to be revolting. There's stories now about Republicans regretting voting for Trump now because of his association with Elon Musk. And it's not just Elon Musk. He's just the front man. Look at Thiel above him. He's the puppet master in all of this. And you will read all about this in Julie's piece called The Network State, that she's going to post in her Substack, and it will be a paid subscription or a paywall read, okay? Because, like I said, we need to start paying some bills. We'll set that up early next week or by tomorrow. I don't know when it's going to go up, but it'll go up soon. And it's important. It's an important read. So I would suggest you all do that. Pay attention to what's down here. You can make a one-time donation to PayPal. People have done it already. Thank you very much to all of you who have donated to us through PayPal, through Buy Me a Coffee. We would love to bump up our Patreon count. We're really small right now. We used to be a lot bigger. So what we'd like to do is start producing more content for you. We don't need to produce T-shirts and gizmos and whatever to make you happy. What we want to do is provide you with content that you enjoy, that is more in depth, maybe, or whatever. We're exploring that right now and seeing what that looks like. Now that I have a little time on my hands, aside from looking for work and shoring up this house and healing up from the plague, it's been a wild 3 weeks. we've gone from, a massive snowstorm in a place that does not have the infrastructure to support that. I didn't even have a snow shovel or salt like what I had in Pittsburgh. So we basically were all stuck inside, and those of us who worked from home. So I didn't get to go out and play in it. Like my friends who didn't have to work. And I'm glad that they got out to play, but, and that's important, so get out and play. But, getting back to this, we're not looking for your charity. We're looking for support because we do what we do. Think of this as just like, any other subscription or, dare I say PBS or NPR. We're producing content that you enjoy, and we're looking for, a donation to help us continue that. And that's what we're looking for. So it's an exchange. We're not looking for charity. And for those of you who have given us money, thank you so much. It is, it's a big deal. It really is. So thank you. It doesn't take a lot. And if you really, really don't like dealing with these digital interfaces, I agree. I'm fine with that. Email us info@book-of-hours.com. And and you can find that on our website, book-of-hours.com. And you can email us and find out where you can send a check. Remember those? We still have we got ourselves a new checkbook because we moved. We have a new bank, so we got ourselves a new checkbook. So we still write checks now and then. And if you do and you prefer doing that, just let us know. Anything helps. And I want to thank you for joining me for this hour and a half of E.F. Schumacher and some commentary. I was planning on just doing the reading because I'm still getting over something. I'm still coughing. You probably heard me once. Julie's in worse shape, so she didn't do it today, so I'm doing it for her. And, we'll probably both start doing some readings and other things in the future. So, again, thank you for joining us. Thank you to all our friends out there who support us and who have been writing to us. And those of you who've been giving us money, thank you. Happy Mardi Gras season, and I hope to see you again very soon. Bye. You can help us continue our work by becoming a patron at patreon.com/bookofhours, or leave us a one-time donation at paypal.me/bookofhours. Or you can use Cash App. Thank you.